Hello and welcome to another ASP.NET Core coding tutorial from Round the Code. Now today we're going to have a look at basic authentication and how we go about implementing it into an ASP.NET Core application. Now this starts a brand new series where basically we're going to have a look at OAuth security and we're going to have a look and basically use basic authentication when generating a bearer token. Now for more ASP.NET Core coding tutorials, visit roundthecode.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/roundthecode and follow us on Twitter, it's @roundthecode. Now basic authentication works like this. You've got your username and your password and it's separated by a colon. From there you use the base64 cryptography and basically encode it into a hash. From there you basically add the word basic followed by a space, then add the actual hash in. You then basically add that into a HTTP request authorization header. Now that we've got an understanding of how basic authentication works, let's go ahead and implement it into an ASP.NET Core application. So we've set up our ASP.NET Core MVC application. So what we need to do first is we need to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager and Package Manager Console. What we need to install is the package Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authorization. Okay, that's successfully installed. So what we need to do now is we need to create a new attribute. Now we're going to use this attribute on actions. So basically, whenever we want a particular action to be under basic authentication, we can just append that attribute above the action. So to do this, what we need to do is we need to create a new class. So we go to new item and we're going to call it basic authorize attribute. So that's created that for us. Now what we need to do is we need to inherit the authorize attribute. Just bring in the assembly for that. And now basically what we need to do is we need to create a constructor for it. And we need to set a policy name, and we'll come back to the policy a little bit later on in the video. But for this, we're going to set it as basic authentication for now. Okay, so that's that part done. Next, what we need to do is we need to create another new class, and we're going to call this one Authenticated User. Now the whole point of this is basically when we authenticate the user, we want to know what the username is, whether they've been authenticated and how they've been authenticated. So once again, we're going to create a new class and we're going to call it Authenticated User. So we're going to inherit the iIdentity interface. And what we need to do is we need to bring in the methods that it requires. So it requires an authentication type, whether the user's authenticated, and a name for it as well. So we're going to create a new constructor for this. And we're going to pass in these particular properties as parameters into the constructor. So let's say it's authenticated and the name. Like so. We're going to make these properties of getter and setter. In fact, just get, because we're going to be setting it inside the constructor when we actually create an instance of it. Okay, so now all we need to do now is basically the parameters that we're passing in, we just need to set to the relevant property. So authentication type, let's do a bit of copy and paste here, equals the authentication type being passed in. Same for is authenticated, and the same for name. Okay, so that's our authenticated user set up. Now what we need to do is basically, with the basic authorization or authentication, we basically need to set up a handler, and this will basically tell us how it's going to work. We're basically going to write the functionality to make it work. So to do that, once again, we're going to create a new class and we're going to call it basic authentication handler. So we've created that, and we need to inherit the authentication handler, and we need to pass in the authentication scheme options as a generic type. Like so. Just need to pass in the assemblies. So it's the authentication scheme options. That's what we need. So we need to create a constructor for this. We're going to create a new constructor. We need to pass in options monitor, authentication scheme options. We need to pass in logger factory. We call that logger. We also need to pass in URL encoder, and we're going to call that encoder. And we need to pass in the clock as well. And this is just basically going to call the inherited constructor. So we're just going to pass it in as a base, pass in the options logger, encoder, and the clock, like so. So now that we've done that, we need to basically override a particular method, and we're going to override the handle authenticate async. So this is basically where all the functionality is going to work. So we do a protected override, and we're going to do task authenticated result. Handle authenticate async. So first thing we need to do is basically with basic authentication, you can actually make it so your browser actually shows the actual username and password dialog box that pops up. And the way you can do this is basically you can add a header to the response, and you pass in a header of www-authenticate, and you set it to basic because we're using basic authentication. Now you may not necessarily need that if you're just doing it, if you're connecting it through maybe an application and you're connecting it to an API and you're passing in a basic header, you might not need this. But if you're doing it through a browser, then this will basically pop up the username and password dialog box. So the first thing we need to do is basically, as I said at the beginning of the video, we need to have the authorization header. So it needs to have a check to see if that actually exists. So we can do request.headers contains key authorization. And if that's not on there, then we're basically going to throw an unauthorized error. So what we do is we basically return task from result, and it's basically the authenticate result.fail, and we're just going to give it a message authorization header is missing, and that will basically throw a 401 back to the actual response. So assuming it passes that, we know that it's got an authorization key, so we need to get the value out of that. So we'll declare a new variable, and we'll get the actual header, the authorization header. And we're also going to set up a regular expression. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, your header needs to be basic space, and then it's basically the base 64 encode of your username and password. So this is basically what it's checking here. So we're going to check to make sure that the value in the authorization header actually matches. So we can do that by saying if it doesn't match the authorization header value, then once again we're going to throw an error. So we're going to return a failed result, and we're going to put that it's not formatted properly. Okay, so assuming it's done that test, it's done fine, we're basically now going to go ahead and we're basically going to decode our encrypted username and password. So we actually know what the username and password is. So to do that, what we can do is we go encode in UTF-8 get string and then convert from base 64 string. So we're basically decoding it. Auth header regex replace, so we're using this regex up here, and authorization header with $1, and that will basically give us our username and password. Okay, so now that we've done that, what we can do then is because the username and password is split by colon, we can basically split it up. So one thing to note with this is basically the username cannot have a colon because basically the first colon actually separates the username and the password. But a password, as far as I know, can have a colon because we're only using the first one. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create another variable called authSplit. And this is basically going to split it up based on the colon. Now we need to add an extra parameter in here. We basically only want to return 2 results, so we only want to split it at the first colon. So if the password has a colon, we don't want to be splitting it up anymore. We can get the username from the authSplit array, so it'll be the obviously index of 0, and then the password, need to do a check and make sure that it's actually split into 2. If it's not, we throw a new exception, unable to get password. So for this, as you saw at the start, we're going to have the username of round the code and the password of round the code as well. So we're going to do a check and make sure that the 2 actually are equal. So if the username is not round the code or the password is not round the code, once again we're going to throw a 401 not authorized error. So we're just basically going to say that the username or password is not correct. Okay, from here, so basically we've managed to, we're satisfied that the username and password is correct. What we can do now is basically create a new authenticated user. So going back to the class that we created at the start of this, we're basically going to call that now. We're going to call it, we're basically going to set an authentication type for basic authentication, set that it's true, and put the name around the code. Now from here, we're going to set up a new claims principal. And we're going to create a new instance of that. And we're going to set a new claims identity, and we're going to pass in the authenticated user. Okay, so satisfied that's all working. So now all we need to do is just to return the success result. So in order to do that, what we can do is we call the task.fromResult. We're going to call authenticated result again, but we're going to call success this time. And we're going to set up a new authentication ticket in there. And we're going to pass in the claims principal and the authenticator scheme, which we can set as scheme.name. Okay, so that's our handler set up. Now what we need to do is we need to configure it into the startup file. So in order to do that, we can go into startup, and what we need to do is we need to go into configure services. In here we need to call services, add authentication, and this is where we can set up a new scheme for our basic authentication. So we go in here, we go add scheme. We need to pass in the authentication scheme options as one of the generic types, and the handler, which you can probably guess is the handler we just created, called basic authentication handler. So in here we just need to give the authentication scheme a name. We're going to call it basic authentication, and we need to pass in options, but we're not actually going to set any options, so we can sort of leave this blank. Next thing we need to do is we basically need to add the authorization, and we need to add a policy. So basically, if we go back to the basic authorize attribute, we set a policy in here of basic authentication. We need to now go ahead and actually create that policy. So in order to do that, we call the add authorization method, pass in some options. In here, we need to add a new policy. So if we set that to options, we need to call it basic authentication, and then we can call a new authorization policy builder. And pass in basic authentication as the authentication scheme name. We need to set that we require an authenticated user, and we need to build it like so. Right, so that's our basic authentication setup. Now it's time to try it out. So what we can do is, this is basically a default ASP.NET Core MVC application. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to add our basic authentication into our privacy action. Basic authorize. There we go. Basic authorize. So we know when we click on the privacy page, we should, in theory, we should get a username and password pop up. And the reason being is because if we go back to the authentication header, we've added this response.headers.add www-authenticate as basic. So let's go ahead and run our application and see if that actually works. There we go. You can see now that that's running for us. So let's click on the privacy, and you can see, yeah, the username and password has basically popped up. So we're going to put our username in as round the code and the password as round the code. As you can see now, that's signed in for us, and that's basically authenticated for us. Now if we have a look at developer tools, and if we refresh the page, and if we look at privacy in particular, and we'll have a look at the request headers, you can see the authorization in here is basic, and it's basically got our hash in there. So that's basically round the code, colon, round the code, and it's been encoded using base 64. Now that we know how to implement basic authentication into an ASP.NET Core application, we're going to go ahead and basically use it to generate a bearer token. In the next part, what we're going to be basically doing is generating a bearer token for OAuth security, and we're going to be using basic authentication for some extra security. That's all coming up in part 2, so you should check it out.